Good evening, everyone. My name is James Pula. I'm Professor Emeritus at Purdue University in Indiana, and I'm happy that you're able to join us today. I hope you find my presentation on Dan Butterfield interesting. Butterfield, during the Civil War centennial, Butterfield is from New York, and New York State published a series of booklets on the Civil War. And the editor at one point said, beyond argument, the fightingest general the state has given to the Civil War was Dan Butterfield. But then he went on to qualify it, saying that he marveled that the name of Butterfield is not conspicuous in Civil War literature. Well, this is 60 years later, and up until this point, the same thing could be true. Butterfield was born in October of 1831. His father was John Butterfield, who was a wealthy investor in Utica, New York. He owned a freight company, packet boats, or telegraph lines. He and Ezra Cornell opened the first telegraph line from New York City to Buffalo. And in the 1850s, when the federal government offered contracts, the first contracts for hauling freight and passengers from the East Coast out to California, Butterfield's company won that. So he was the first company to carry freight and passengers back and forth to California. He was also one of the founders of something you probably recognize today called American Express. So, needless to say, Dan Butterfield grew up in a relatively affluent family with a lot of advantages. He attended Union College, getting a baccalaureate degree in 1849. He planned to study law, but he found out that New York State law prevented people of his age from having law degrees. So instead, he took a tour out to Minnesota, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and in New Orleans, he ran face to face with the slavery in the South, and became convinced that the issues of the day were not going to be easily solved. So he comes back to New York. He's named the general superintendent for the Eastern Division of American Express. I guess it helps that your father owns the company since he was so young. And he also joins the 71st New York State Militia. There came a time to mind a plain duty to prepare to the best of my ability for what seemed the inevitable upon every patriot and lover of his country who had any desire to discharge his duty. So Butterfield joins the New York State Militia. A couple of years later, when it's reorganized, he's named colonel of the 12th New York State Militia, which was a unit out of the New York City area where his office with American Express was. Here you see Dan with his little English style mustache as a militia officer. A friend from Virginia writes to him and asks him where he stands in the national crisis. And he writes back, he said, I should most sincerely regret that any combination of circumstances should place me in a position to be called upon to use any portion of the knowledge or skill I may possess in a military way against our erring brethren of the South. But what I find particularly interesting about this is the date, April 11th, 1861, just one day before Fort Sumter is fired on, initiating the war. So Butterfield has the 12th New York, which numbered about 350 men at the time, not big enough to go off to war. So within a month, he recruits another 600 men, and they are sent off to Washington, D.C. Here's a picture of the officers at Camp Anderson with Dan Butterfield in the front row with his light-colored wide-brim hat. So he has about a month to train some 600 brand new volunteers in the 12th New York. And apparently he does a pretty good job because they have a review before the president and the general of the Army, Winfield Scott. And after it's over, Scott calls him up to the reviewing stand and tells him, Your regiment, sir, marched like regulars, which was a good compliment from Scott or any other regular officer. Apparently, Scott believed it because he selected the 12th New York to be the lead regiment in the first major movement into Northern Virginia in May of 1861. From there, he nominates, Scott that is, nominates Butterfield to be Brigadier General, and he's given a brigade in the Third Army Corps. One of the soldiers in that corps, Gene Nash of the 44th New York, wrote that Butterfield was thought to be rather too strict. There was squad drill, guard mounting, police work, company drill, battalion drill, brigade drill, dress parade, reveille, breakfast call, sickness call, dinner call, supper call, tattoo, and to fill in there with guard duty, picket duty, lessons and tactics. The routine of daily duties was based on the assumption that 27 hours constituted a day. So a lot of the soldiers thought that he was way too strict and demanding of them when they were at drill. Anyone who's seen the movie Gettysburg, which I assume you all have, is familiar with the scene where they talk about Butterfield devising this special call for his brigade so that when the soldiers heard it, they knew the next call would be for them. And the soldiers, as they will, came up with a little rhyme to match the score of the music. Dan, 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 Butterfield, Butterfield. And people like Nash, who didn't appreciate his discipline, quickly changed the lyrics somewhat. Over the winter, Butterfield writes Camp and Outpost Duty for Infantry. Now, this is the first time in American history where the United States has such massive armies, and there were no training guides or anything for armies that big. O. O. Howard wrote there was a great need of something that would adapt itself to new circumstances, where a large army was forming in the face of a hostile force. Butterfield's plan was simple, easily mastered by officers and men, very effective in covering large frontage, keeping the main body in comparative safety. And when Joe Hooker becomes commanding general, he mandates its use throughout the Army of the Army of the Potomac. And then from there, it spreads to the West, and by the late 1864, it's being used as the training manual throughout the entire Union Army. George McClellan's campaign begins, of course, in the spring of 1862. Confederate Army roughly here. McClellan decides to move his forces by boat down to Fort Monroe on the York Peninsula to bypass the main Confederate Army and then move with lightning speed toward Richmond. Of course, I'm sure you all know McClellan never did anything with lightning speed. So we end up with a situation somewhat like this, with the Confederate Army coming back to defend Richmond and McClellan's army in roughly this position. And you notice the Chickahominy River divides the Union Army, with Fitzjohn Porter's corps to the north, which contained Butterfield's brigade. So the Confederates decide to take advantage of this. They're going to attack Porter, isolated on the northern side of the river before the rest of the army can come to his aid or he can retreat. So they move forces into position and then they attack. The result is the Battle of Gaines' Mill. The Union forces roughly here, Confederate forces roughly here. The Confederate plan is to attack the Union left, and once all of the reserves are committed, then to outflank the right, pinch in behind the river, and hopefully capture the entire corps because it'll be unable to cross the river. So the attack begins with an attack by Longstreet's troops on Butterfield's brigade. Butterfield horse was shot from under him. A bullet penetrated his hat, and another one bounced off of his saber, apparently. The colonel of the 83rd Pennsylvania writes, at this moment, Brigadier General Butterfield, amidst a galling fire from his lines of support in the rear and that of the enemy in front, came coolly down the knoll and, sword in hand, seized our colors, waving them repeatedly aloft, and by all mortal means encouraged the valor of our regiment. His presence, at once stimulated with new vigor, our now thinned ranks. So the Confederate attack is beaten back. The second attack falls slightly to Butterfield's right and begins to penetrate the Union line. So Butterfield moves his two reserve regiments to plug the hole, which gives Porter a chance to withdraw the army back safely across the river. Because while this is going on, the Confederates start to outflank the Union right, so now it becomes necessary to retreat, and Butterfield covers the retreat. Following the battle, he's nominated for the Medal of Honor for his conduct, and he later, after the war, receives it. From Gaines' Mill, the fighting continues on south, with Butterfield mostly in reserve until they get to Malvern Hill. At Malvern Hill, he again holds the left of the Federal line against several Confederate attacks. The lieutenant colonel of the 12th New York wrote, "When the heaviest cannonading was going on, the activity and spirit of our general gave life and confidence to the officers and men of my command, and wherever he rode, out or in, watching the progress of the fight, his presence was hailed by the men with enthusiasm." Uh, During the later course of the fight, a regiment, well, a brigade rather, of reserves comes up. It's the Irish Brigade, led by General Marr. And he writes, "We were met by Brigadier General Butterfield, who, grasping the distinctive green flag of the leading regiment of the brigade, exhibited the ardor of a general who was personally interested in its honor, and thereby renewed and re-excited the spirit of the advance." Butterfield's superior, Fitzjohn Porter, wrote that Butterfield was certainly a splendid commander and a good model for anyone. Quick, brave, and his men had perfect confidence in him. Butterfield's conduct was admirable. He had no superior as a soldier among the young volunteer commanders who came under my personal notice. The author of the Fifth Corps history, William Powell, was a veteran of this campaign, and he wrote, "All reports bear witness to the care, energy, and ability of General Butterfield in the handling of his brigade, and to his personal gallantry in inspiring and leading his troops." At the end of the campaign, uh, the troops, as kind of an environment of morose envelops the troops. They've been in heavy engagements. They've had a lot of high casualty rates. And here they've retreated back to the Union base of supplies. Butterfield, in particular, was feeling bad because he had come down with a case of malaria as well and was not feeling well from that. So when they play the normal lights out sign, bugle call at the end of the day, uh, for the troops to extinguish lights and get ready to go to bed, Butterfield thinks this is really too jaunty, too upbeat. The Army really needs something different. So he calls his bugler, Oliver Norton, to his tent. And according to Norton, Butterfield whistled some new tune and asked me to sound it. After this was done, not quite to his satisfaction at first, but after repeated trials, changing the time of some of the notes, which were scribbled on the back of an envelope, all was finally arranged to suit the general. Butterfield then ordered the tune to be substituted in his brigade that night. Butterfield called in Norton because Butterfield did not know how to write music, so he had Norton jot it down for them. Of course, the tune becomes taps, and as they say, the rest is history. It spreads to the rest of the Union Army, and then when the 11th and 12th Corps go out to Chattanooga in the fall of '63, it spreads to the Western armies and pretty soon is being used throughout the United States. Robert E. Lee is now in charge of the Confederate Army, and he realizes McClellan is going to do nothing. So he starts to head north. The Federal Army then is withdrawn, with most of it going up the Potomac River to Washington. But there were not enough deep draft boats, so some of the troops were sent up the Rappahannock River and marched overland. And part of this was Butterfield's brigade. So he ends up marching overland toward Manassas Junction and the Second Battle of Bull Run. And here things get kind of interesting. General Morrell is the division commander, and he receives orders to march in the morning from Bristow Station to Centerville. So in the morning, they begin the march. Morrell sets out leading his division. Butterfield's brigade is second in line of march, and when he gets to Manassas Junction, off to the left, he thinks he hears firing. Seems like a battle might be in progress. And while he's listening, a staff officer rides up and tells him, yes, there is a battle going on and they need him there right away. So what does he do? He's under orders to go to Centerville. On the other hand, a battle is in progress and they need him. So on his own initiative, he turns left and heads to the battlefield. And the 3rd Brigade follows him, turns left, and Butterfield ends up on the Second Bull Run battlefield, the senior officer present in the division, so he commands the division, which now, of course, only has 2 brigades. But he's ordered to attack the Confederate lines. He protests. He says they're way too strong for his division to break through, but he's ordered to attack anyway. General George Sykes, who was on hand, wrote that Butterfield's attack was gallantly made and gallantly maintained. It made it close to the Confederate lines before being finally driven back. And one of the officers in the 12th New York noted that in a few moments, Butterfield succeeded in rallying and reforming the brigade, and we were marched off the field in good order. We now felt secure in the hands of our general, as we had previous proofs of his bravery and judgment. So, although the attack fails, Butterfield again gets praise. And here things really get interesting because after a second Bull Run, Fitzjohn Porter is court-martialed by John Pope. Well, as it turns out, the senior officer left in the Corps is Dan Butterfield. So Butterfield not only is promoted to division command, but a few days later finds himself in command of the Fifth Corps heading into the Battle of Fredericksburg. So here you have somebody who was a relatively unknown militia colonel in the spring of 1861. By the fall of the following year, he's a major general heading the Fifth Army Corps. At Fredericksburg, he's held in reserve until late on December 13th, until he's finally asked to cross the river and join the fight. Two of his divisions are engaged. The third stays in reserve. And eventually, of course, Burnside calls off the attacks, and Butterfield is charged with covering the retreat back across the river. So he waits until dark. Fortunately for him, it's also kind of foggy that night, and he manages the retreat. One of the people involved said that the withdrawal of the army from Fredericksburg was carried out in the most admirable manner. No confusion occurred, no haste, no disorder, and not a moment was lost. In fact, not a single gun was lost, not a single wagon was lost, no one was captured, and Butterfield himself personally was the last officer to step foot on the last pontoon that shoved off for the opposite side of the river. So he really conducted the retreat under the nose of the Confederates and Confederate artillery in exemplary fashion. Joe Hooker wrote that to Butterfield, much praise is due for the spirit and energy displayed in the execution of orders and gallantry throughout all our operations. Of course, despite all of this, Fredericksburg turns out to be a disaster. Uh, Northern morale spirals down and changes are in order. One of the people complaining is George Meade. Meade goes to Ambrose Burnside, in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and complains that Butterfield is commanding the Fifth Corps, and George Meade, who is his senior officer, is only commanding a division. So Burnside replaces Butterfield with Meade, and Butterfield is just heartbroken. Butterfield later says that when he accepted the command of the Fifth Corps, Burnside promised him that it was that it was permanent, and now he's going back on his promise. So Butterfield really feels injured by this. But his career is saved by Joe Hooker, who replaces Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac and names Butterfield as his chief of staff. So life goes on, as they say. Theodore Dodge became a noted historian after the war. He also had an opportunity to meet Butterfield shortly after the change of command. Butterfield's a young man, scarcely 30, rather handsome, wears a black mustache, stout face and figure, very cool and collected in his manners, and very gentlemanly. The general received us very graciously and entertained us most pleasantly for an hour or so when we took our leave. If you look at a lot of the letters and diaries, a lot of the officers who had the occasion to meet Butterfield commented on what a wonderful host he was, and he would always invite his officers to Thanksgiving dinner and other holidays. But he could afford to do so. It helped that his father was the head of the corporation because the board of directors of the company, unlike virtually every other officer who went off to war, the board of directors voted to continue paying him his normal salary while he was in uniform. So he certainly had plenty of money to entertain people and to expend on dinners and so on. As chief of staff, Butterfield was largely responsible for reorganizing the army after Fredericksburg as terms of enlistments expired and soldiers left, and then several thousand soldiers joined as reinforcements. He also instituted the first symbols to recognize the different corps out in the field. He came up with the red, white, and blue designation for the different divisions within the Corps, and he personally selected the different symbols to be used. Later, when the 11th and 12th Corps go west and the Western armies see these symbols, they're intrigued. Butterfield designs a symbol for the 14th Corps out west, and then it spreads to the Western armies as well. Henry Slocum wrote that Hooker was fortunate in having as his chief of staff Major General Daniel Butterfield, who was untiring in aiding and devising ways and means of continuing the Army in the best possible condition of efficiency within the bounds of simplicity. Henry Tremaine, a staff officer at Army headquarters, wrote that the headquarters of the Army became transformed from a habitual depot of delays to a model of neatness and dispatch in the transaction of public business. And you have to remember, Butterfield's expertise, his forte, was in management. He had been managing an entire section of the American Express Company. So the management of movements and things and so forth like that was really his expertise. At Chancellorsville, Joe Hooker decides to take part of the army in behind the Confederate army at Fredericksburg, which forces Lee, of course, to divide his command. Butterfield's role in this as chief of staff was to remain behind in Falmouth and serve as kind of the linchpin between the different wings. He would relay orders from Hooker to General Sedgwick in Fredericksburg, or reports from Sedgwick back to Hooker. He also served as the liaison with Washington, D.C., the War Department, and the President. He drafted orders. He was responsible for coordinating reconnaissance, construction of pontoon bridges, requisitioning supplies and ammunition, distributing things like horses and mules to the appropriate commands. He was in charge of the newly created Bureau of Military Information to collect, collate, and distribute information, intelligence to the different commands. And he was responsible for counterintelligence, preventing leaks, preventing spies from passing the lines, preventing desertions, and so forth. So he was really the linchpin in all of this between the Hooker's wing and the Army back in Fredericksburg, but also with the Army out in the Shenandoah Valley and with the Navy, which was ferrying in supplies and so forth to sustain the Army. Chancellorsville, of course, turns out to be a disaster through no fault of Dan's. And there's two immediate issues that need attending to. One is readying the Army for the new campaign. The other is determining Lee's strength and plans. And Butterfield is deeply involved in both as chief of staff, both the resupply and distribution of ammunition, equipment, provisions, medical supplies, and so on, and also coordinating all of these intelligence activities to find out what the enemy's intentions are. Lee decides to invade the North. So he moves west and then up north behind the Blue Ridge, and eventually the Union Army follows. Now you've got 90,000 men in the Union Army in motion. Butterfield is issuing orders, and simply issuing orders is not good enough. 90,000 men with all of their wagons and everything else, if you stretch them out on a single road, would go halfway across Virginia. So what Butterfield has to do is to find adjoining roads that don't come together at crosswords. He needs to know the conditions of the road, whether the bridges are strong enough to support artillery and wagons, whether at this point in the year the fords are low enough to be used, and he has to find alternate roadways so that they don't come together at a single intersection, which is going to impede the movement of the Army north. He has to make sure the routes are sufficiently separated, and he has to choreograph all of this. General Halleck and General Hooker don't agree. Hooker eventually tenders his resignation, probably not really thinking that it's going to be accepted, but it is. So Halleck gives Hooker the boot. And lo and behold, George Meade is appointed the new commander of the Army of the Potomac. First thing he does after taking command is to ask Seth Williams if he will replace Butterfield as the new chief of staff. And Williams declines. So he asks Andrew Humphreys, and Humphreys declines. And Humphreys tells him, well, you really should keep Butterfield because he's the only person who knows where the army is. General Hooker had turned over command and then promptly left. So the only person with a knowledge of what the plans were was Butterfield. So Meade asks Gouverneur Warren if he will be the new chief of staff. And Warren essentially seconds what Humphreys has said, that you really ought to keep Butterfield. So by process of elimination, Butterfield remains as chief of staff. And he's largely responsible for informing Meade of the disposition of the army, where the different troops are, what the intentions are, where they're moving, and so forth. He's also responsible then for drafting further orders to consolidate the army, coordinating intelligence, mapping the roadways, and everything he did for the Chancellorsville campaign. Communicating with the army was difficult. Now remember, the army's in motion. Butterfield's own headquarters is moving every single day. All of the corps headquarters are moving every single day. All of the division headquarters, all of the brigade headquarters. So Butterfield needs to keep track of where all these different headquarters are each day and to inform them where he expects to be the next day. And he also has to pick routes for couriers that are less likely to be intercepted by Confederate cavalry as well. So this whole intricate ballet is what he has to choreograph. One of the things he does is to assign two signal officers to each Army Corps with telegraphic equipment and flags. One of the Signal Corps officers wrote that this provided a rapid means of communication between the 1st, 11th, and 12th Corps that were in the closest proximity to Lee's army. And historian Peter Tsouras noted that these changes were, quote, a vital step in creating a near real-time communication and intelligence system, unquote. Gouverneur Warren wrote that the troops continued to move on just the same as if the command had not been changed. And Meade himself wrote that the army was well concentrated and moving with all the speed that the fatigue of the men would bear. So here we have the Gettysburg campaign. Gettysburg in the middle, Lee beginning to consolidate his forces in that direction, Meade and Butterfield at headquarters in Tonytown, Maryland. Some authors have charged that Butterfield was slow in issuing orders to concentrate the army at Gettysburg. But on the afternoon of July 1st, Meade and Butterfield went to meet with General Hancock. Meade ordered Hancock to go personally to Gettysburg to determine whether the army ought to consolidate in that vicinity or retire behind the Pipe Creek line that he had previously designated. So clearly, by afternoon of July 1st, Meade had not made any determination to concentrate at Gettysburg. Hancock said that he arrived in Gettysburg around 3 o'clock, 3:30. It was probably more like 4:30. But in any case, his report to Meade, his written report, is timed at 5:25 p.m. It probably took an hour to an hour and a half for it to reach Meade's hands because of the distance. So by the time it reaches Meade, was impossible for Butterfield to issue orders to move directly to Gettysburg because by late evening, July 1st, Meade had not even made that decision. And Meade then goes off to Gettysburg to look for himself to find out what's happening. Some authors have claimed that because Meade did not trust Butterfield, a lot of his orders during this crucial period were signed by Seth Williams, not by Butterfield. But when Meade leaves to go personally to Gettysburg, Butterfield remains at headquarters in Tawnytown for several hours. Now, this makes perfect sense. The whole army thinks that headquarters is at Tawnytown, so they're going to be sending dispatches there. And if no one is there, it's going to take them a long time to figure out where in the world the headquarters is. And even if they know it's at Gettysburg, they're going to lose valuable time then heading off to Gettysburg. So it's perfectly reasonable the chief of staff would remain there to inform, at least as long as he needed to inform all of the other commands of what was happening and where they were going to be. Numerous messages from him to corps commanders and to me attest to this assignment. So this explains why late July 1 and early July 2 orders are signed by Williams and not by Butterfield. Butterfield doesn't arrive at Gettysburg until sometime on the morning of July 2. So clearly, in his absence, if Meade is issuing orders, somebody else is signing for them. July 2, probably the most famous council of war of the war, occurs on Meade's headquarters. And here you see Butterfield sitting at a table taking notes. And again, here, Butterfield's managerial experience comes in handy. As generals arrive, they begin a general conversation. One or two of them fall asleep in the corner. Butterfield finally offers specific questions. This is important because it begins to focus the discussion on key issues of the day. He asks, under the existing circumstances, should the Army remain in its present position? If it does remain, shall it attack or await attack? If we await attack, how long? Through his management skills, Butterfield directs the discussion to these important issues, and then he asks for a vote. And by using the vote, this is a means of ending discussion. Okay, we're going to vote on this. But it's also a means of showing who is committed to this or not, so that after the battle, if things do not go well, General A cannot say, oh, I never supported this in the first place, because now they're on record having voted for it or against it. Morning of July 3rd, Butterfield begins to survey where the Union Army troops are, trying to correct some of the disorder and get units back to where they belong. He sends another aide to the artillery reserve to check on the status of the artillery ammunition. And then he joins Meade and Quartermaster Rufus Ingalls to discuss the situation and see if Meade might have any other orders. At that point, a Confederate artillery shell hits nearby, and a piece of the shrapnel hits Butterfield in the chest, the left chest, just below the heart. It's a 1.43 pound fragment. Some of Butterfield's friends pick it up, and they later put a plaque on it and give it to him as a memento. But in the meantime, he's carried off to a field hospital. I know it's 1.43 pounds because here's a picture of it, and I actually weighed it. Butterfield leaves for a convalescent leave, and Meade writes to him, I shall never cease to remember and to bear testimony to the efficient assistance you so heartily rendered me, and without which I hardly know how I should have gotten through with the new and arduous duties imposed on me. Meade, of course, appoints Humphreys to replace Butterfield, which is reasonable. You need a new chief of staff since Butterfield is away on convalescent leave. Butterfield finds out, and he writes to Meade and asks him, what's up? And Meade writes back, trusting my dear general, you will understand the necessity which compelled me to appoint a successor, and that you will believe my assurance that it did not arise from any want of confidence in you, etc., etc. Now, Butterfield writes again, and he said, well, what should I do when I'm well enough to return? Should I rejoin the Army? Should I go to Washington? What's going on? And at that point, Meade, probably being a little testy by this point, writes back and it says, well, I don't know. Why don't you go to Washington? And of course, now Butterfield is feeling imposed upon again. He loses command of the Fifth Corps through no fault of his own. And now, even though Meade is praising him, he's replacing him. The staff officer, Tremaine, at Army headquarters later wrote, although he was not the commander of the Army of the Potomac, yet so far as the chief of staff can be awarded credit, the work of General Butterfield as chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac is entitled to an exceptional place in the history of that army. Following Gettysburg, Union forces are south of D.C. Confederates are besieging Chattanooga. So the War Department decides to send the 11th and 12th Corps west to help relieve the siege of Chattanooga. They pull Joe Hooker off the shelf and put him in command, and Hooker retrieves yet again the career of Dan Butterfield as chief of staff. So the troops go west by rail to Indianapolis and then south from Indianapolis to northwestern Alabama. In 11 and a half days, 17,500 men, 10 entire batteries of artillery, over 700 wagons and ambulances, over 4,400 horses and mules, all of the baggage of two entire corps are transported almost 1,200 miles over track and arrive in northern Alabama. At the time, this was the largest movement of anything by rail in history. And the person who managed all of this was none other than Dan Butterfield. Here's a picture of Butterfield and Hooker in Chattanooga. Butterfield's managed the movement west. He led briefly a division of troops securing the communication lines north toward Nashville once the army arrived. And then he was responsible for planning the movement into Chattanooga that opened up the so-called Cracker Line, and then the assault on Lookout Mountain, which was extremely successful. Following the campaign, Joe Hooker wrote in a personal letter to Butterfield, "You deserve for your promptitude, energy, and management a much higher reward than I can give you." And in his final report on the campaign, he wrote, "I must express my grateful acknowledgement to Major General Butterfield, Chief of Staff, for the valuable assistance rendered me on the field." Following Chattanooga, the 11th and 12th Corps are consolidated into the 20th. Hooker is given command, and Hooker invites Butterfield to remain as his chief of staff. And Butterfield says, "No, I don't really want to be chief of staff anymore. I really want to lead a combat division." So Hooker appoints him to lead the 3rd Division of the 20th Army Corps. And in that position, he takes part in Sherman's march toward Atlanta, skirmishing frequently almost every day as the Army moves south to Resaca, Georgia. When it gets to Resaca, Butterfield's command is ordered to launch an attack on the Confederate right. Here's the rough position of the Confederate Army. Butterfield's division, or rather Butterfield's, his 3 brigades that make up his division. And here's a picture. I'm not sure if this is exactly where the charge was made, but it's in very close proximity. And you can see here, there's heavy brush along the way. There are 2 rather deep gullies with brush in them that have to be uh, circumvented in order to get to the hill beyond. So what Butterfield does, he orders his troops, he orders that there be no pre-attack bombardment because that will give away the fact that an attack is coming. He orders that no skirmishers be sent forward because that would give away the attack. And he orders the attacking troops to be ready, get ready, and on his signal to run as fast as they can toward that hill and toward the Confederate lines and not to shoot until they actually reach the Confederate lines. Speed is of the utmost importance. They have to get over these terrain obstacles and up to the hill before the Confederates realize they're coming and can respond appropriately. And they do. They make it into the first set of Confederate works, capture the battery and the colors of the Cherokee Battery. And here you can see an interesting illustration from Harper's Weekly. They captured the outer Confederate works. The Confederate Army still manned the inner works. And here you can see the Confederates in the background shooting at them as they cut a hole in the outer works and use grappling tools to remove the 4 guns and take them back into captivity. From Resaca, the Army heads further south toward Atlanta until June 29th, when Butterfield comes down with another case of malaria, diarrhea, exposure, and sunstroke, and is forced to go off for another 30 days convalescent leave. General Thomas writes, "From what I have myself seen of the manner in which Butterfield handles his troops and his good conduct in the battle, I take pleasure in recommending him for a corps." William Tecumseh Sherman writes, "Butterfield is zealous and full of knowledge." To Butterfield himself, he writes in a letter, "I regret exceedingly that you are forced to leave, as we cannot well spare you." So clearly Butterfield was, the officers he served with and served under in the West felt very positively about him. Butterfield participated in 28 battles and 15 skirmishes. He was given brevets of colonel, brigadier general, and major general in the regular army. While recovering from his various ailments, he commanded a recruit depot in New York City and provided security in New York City for the 1864 elections when they were afraid that there was going to be some attempt to prevent the elections. He also served as chair for the return of the volunteer colors to the state after the war was over, and remained in the Army until March 14th, when he resigned his commission on the death of his father in order to take over the private business. Following the war, Butterfield was active in the formation of the Grand Army of the Republic. Here's a picture of him with General Sickles and Longstreet on the 25th anniversary celebrations at Gettysburg, or perhaps I should say commemorations rather than celebrations. When the state of New York decided to erect monuments to its soldiers at Gettysburg, it provided $1,500 for each regiment and battery. Butterfield's original 12th New York had gone out of existence by that time, but its veterans had been amalgamated into the 44th New York. So Butterfield, out of his own money, doubled the $1,500 to $3,000, provided that the names of every single soldier in the 44th New York who served on that battlefield would be inscribed in the monument. And if you go there today and look inside, they are. His wife added $500, and the two of them began a fundraising campaign that eventually ended up raising $20,000 for what is one of, if not the largest regimental monument on the entire battlefield. Now, of course, there's been a little bit of inflation since that time. The rough equivalent of $20,000 in 2024 currency would be almost $700,000 in today's money. Butterfield also, out of his own pocket, paid for a monument to the Fifth Corps at Fredericksburg, and here's a picture of it. You know, how many generals do you know that reached into their own pocket to erect monuments to their own troops? Much less, in the case of the one at Fredericksburg, on a battlefield where the Union Army lost, but Dan Butterfield did. Here's a picture of Butterfield's grave at West Point. Butterfield suffered a stroke in 1901, a few weeks before he passed away, and he asked his wife if she could convey a message to the War Department asking whether he could be buried at West Point. At the time, the only people eligible for burial at West Point were graduates of West Point. But as luck would have it, the Secretary of War, Elihu Root, was from Utica, New York, the same place as Dan Butterfield. So Elihu Root said, okay, no problem, as long as you get the permission of the commander of the garrison there. Well, as it so happened, the commander of the West Point at the time was also from upstate New York. So again, with the help of some contacts, I guess you would say, Butterfield was able to be buried at West Point and has one of, if not the largest monument, paid for, of course, by his family, dedicated to anyone at West Point. Following his demise, his wife also paid the noted sculptor John Gutzon Borglum, the person who did the Presidents on Mount Rushmore, commissioned with him this monument to Butterfield, which stands in Sakura Park in New York City today, on Manhattan Island in West 122nd Street. In fact, I saw it earlier in January when I was in New York. So, Butterfield's achievements: he was the author of TAPS, he authored the Union Army Training Manual, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, he was praised for leadership on the Peninsula and Second Bull Run, he was again praised for expertly covering the retreat at Fredericksburg. He was influential in reorganizing the Army of the Potomac after both Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Well, I should say during the Gettysburg campaign, not after Gettysburg. He conceived and designed the first unit identification patches. He managed the concentration of the troops at Gettysburg, and he managed the largest movement by rail in history at that time. He was prominent in the relief of Chattanooga. One thing I didn't mention, he advocated the education of African American soldiers. At the time, there was a recruitment of African Americans. Butterfield went a step farther. He said that they ought to be provided with educational opportunities once they enlisted, because, of course, most of them never had any a chance for formal education. And he also said that part of their salary could voluntarily be withheld each month and given to them when their service ended in a lump sum so that they had enough money to buy land or set up a business or become gainfully employed, something that really didn't happen until almost World War I in the regular U.S. Army. He was praised for his leadership at Resaca, prominent in veterans affairs in the post-war years. He was a founder of the Society of the Army of the Potomac, financed the Gettysburg Monument to his soldiers and the one at Fredericksburg as well. And he also gave liberally to charities after the war, including ones that benefited Southerners as well. For example, at the close of the war, there was a yellow fever and other epidemic ravaging New Orleans and Louisiana. The Union Army general in charge of the occupation wrote to Butterfield and said, you know, there's a shortage of medicine, people are suffering, there ought to be something we can do about this. Butterfield sent a check for $5,000 from his own money, which of course would be worth a lot more than that today, for the suffering of the civilians and military, both Southerners and Northerners in Louisiana at the time. So I thank you very much for your patience in listening to me today. If you see on the screen, the biography of Butterfield was published by Cyrus Beatty, and I have the link here to their website. I would encourage you, if you're interested in Dan Butterfield at all, to contact Savas Beatty for your copy. So if you, let me turn this over to our moderator, and if you have any questions, I would be glad to try to respond to them.